Hello everyone and welcome to a YouTube video where I talk about my 5 great principles of designing and having a great encounter in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Now, these rules probably apply to plenty of tabletop games because they're pretty broad in concept, but I am speaking from experience from running 67 episodes of a 5th edition actual play, Ghost in the Machine, and 27 episodes of a 5th edition actual play, Big Boy Season, which is module. So 1 homebrew, 1 module, and having a variety of experience throughout the years and really trying to hone in on the idea of what is exciting, what is interesting, what makes these encounters worth it, because I think that we've all been in that situation where people are just kind of attacking, there's exchanges of numbers back and forth, none of it really means anything, people are bored, people's eyes are glazing over, there's a hint of excitement here and there, but overall the encounter is kind of a mess, kind of a slog, and everyone walks away with really mixed feelings about it, and in the end we might excuse a lot of things and say, oh, that was fun, but it doesn't spark the joy the way I think that D&D combat should, and I want to impart what I know about designing encounters to you so that maybe be able to help you. Before we really get started, I just want to speak very conceptually that D&D, for me, is a game that is about violent conflict and is a game about resolving things through combat encounters. Not always, not every single time. There are plenty of great moments throughout various actual plays, mine and other ones, where things get resolved non-violently, and that's terrific. But D&D spends a lot of time telling you how to fight, giving you the tools to fight, and to resolve encounters through these means of casting spells, shooting arrows, grappling, tackling, and those kind of things. So I think that combat is not an afterthought in D&D. I think that it's really, really important. It's important to understand how it works. It's important to understand how to manage it. And it's important that you and your group enjoy it, because I really think that if it's not something you enjoy, play the game however you want, whatever works for you and your table. But I would really advise that if D&D combat in its essence doesn't excite you, 5th edition is really not the game for you. But it's just a piece of advice, something I've gleaned through playing other systems, playing 5th edition D&D, that D&D combat is really where the soul of the game lives. And if you don't love it, if you don't live for it, I think it's really important to branch out and try other systems. Okay, so principle 1 of when I am designing encounters for my players. These principles are listed in no particular order, but I'm going to go ahead and start with the one that makes the most sense to me. So, core principle 1, the one that I always go back to, is what is the purpose and or objective / goal of this fight? This can change and vary widely depending on what's going on in this story and what the fight means. But whenever I am building an encounter, I always ask, why am I wanting to throw this in? So the reasons could vary from wanting to introduce a piece of information about the lore, wanting to give your players an easy win or an encounter that is of comedic relief, or of course this encounter requires resolution, whether win, lose, draw, whatever, in order to advance the story. That's usually the most common. But you always want to make sure that the encounter has some sort of purpose and that it has an objective. Now, the objectives can be defeat the enemy. That's fine. But as another objective and or goal of the encounter, if it requires a certain resolution, it can be to, save the victims, keep everyone alive, keep 2 very specific people alive, keep 2 or 3 people from killing one another, keeping 1 person from claiming another person's life, something like that. An objective, something at stake that requires this encounter to be brought forth. Just to give you an example of a encounter that might be more about lore than about a specific boss objective or something like that, I remember recently in Big Boy Season, our Storm King's Thunder campaign, a huge theme of that game is travel, overland travel, and so they're always seeing the different sites and encountering the different creatures of the world. And recently I remember when they were making their way up into the mountains, they encountered a ruin of giant culture, and that was a great opportunity for one of the NPCs that was accompanying them to explain what giant culture was and what Astoria used to be, the Allfather, and cover different pieces of that thing, only just in time for a Remoraz and a Ice Salamander to show up and try to attack the party. And that was really a way to show the way in which monsters in, the Forgotten Realms inhabit the world and the threat that they pose in these former sites, these Forgotten Realms that once housed great civilizations. And you could use a similar theme in a lot of campaigns. That's pretty basic stuff, but it was really interesting and really fun when we did it. On the other side of things, in Ghost of the Machine, I remember in the episode that we ended up titling Redemption, they were tracking down a former ally of theirs who had went on a string of horrific murders, and as they uncovered pieces about what he was doing, they realized he was under the influence of a kind of madness magic that was controlling and dominating his mind and causing him to behave a certain way. So the objective of that fight and the purpose of that fight was less about the lore of the world and more about resolving a specific problems. Our former ally is killing people, and then the goal and objective wasn't to defeat the monster, it was to rescue him. So they had a whole different tactic going in. They were looking for things that restrained, subdued, did other things rather than just get the monster from 100 to 0 and killing him. So there's some great examples, and you can, share your own of what you think has worked for you when you're deciding on objectives. Principle number 2, make sure that the fight is appropriately challenging. Now, when I say appropriately challenging, remember what we just talked about. Sometimes your encounters aren't going to be designed to be easy. Sometimes you're intentionally throwing your players a slow pitch because they've been through a slog, they've defeated the ancient dragon, they've defeated the powerful necromancer, and now in the next encounter they just need to stomp on some dire rats, they need to crack some skulls of some some skeletons, and they just need to have a good time where they feel superior, where they feel empowered, where they feel like they've progressed, that not every encounter exhausts their resources, and they get to have that moment where they just get to play around with the enemy a little bit. So when we say appropriately challenging, we could mean it needs to be designed to fit the goals of what you're trying to achieve. So it's either going to be a little light, a little medium, or heavy. So if I'm doing a light encounter for 5th edition D&D, it depends on the level, but especially after about level 4, level 5, a light encounter for me is half CR, which is like completely inconsequential, or a CR equal to the party's level. Let me say that again. It's half of the party's average level in CR, so a level 4 level 4 party members, a CR2 creature would be inconsequential, right? Or more accurately, especially if your players have maybe a bit higher stats, more magic items, even by level 4, 5, or 6, I would make the challenge rating equal to their levels. So a party of 4 level 5 party members, it would be about CR5-ish creature, or CR5 worth of creatures that I would combine, a bandit captains, a couple orcs, that kind of thing. And that would be what I would consider an encounter on the lighter side of things. Now, for a heavy encounter with multiple units, I would give myself a CR budget of twice the level of the character. So a party of level 4 players would get CR 8-ish worth of enemies. For boss fights, really heavy, really thick boss fights for my players, I'm going to go ahead and use that same budget for a solo creature and make sure they have 1 to 3 legendary actions and 1 to 3 legendary resistances. This is probably the toughest part of designing an encounter, and it can be kind of really maddening. But honestly, what I discovered is if I just use some rough estimates, if I just think and look at the stat block and process what I think it all means, generally speaking, the monster is going to be challenging enough to make it seem real. Using those rough guidelines that I just described, again, have to equal their level in CR for a lighter encounter, double for a boss or a serious encounter. When it's a single creature, legendary actions, legendary resistances are really, really necessary. I found that formula roughly works every single time. As they get higher level, that budget's going to even grow further. For a level 10 to like 13, 14 party, double for a single creature is enough. But you want to make sure they have all 3 legendary resistances, all 3 legendary actions, and good saves in some of the critical areas like Constitution and Wisdom. You also want to consider certain critical kind of saving throws like Constitution. If you have a monk in your party, you want most of your bosses to have a high Constitution, but having such a high Constitution where they cannot fail, like the Stunning Strike save that is con-based, might be very frustrating for your monk players. We've had that happen with some Ancient Dragons that Prism has fought in Ghost of the Machine. Once you've decided on your kind of CR budget, I've been using that framework for many episodes, and honestly, it has worked like a charm almost every single time. The encounters have always felt appropriately challenging enough. Now, my parties in both games have point buy stats. They have pretty normal magic items. I would say Ghost of the Machine players, their magic items, were pretty stacked from a pretty early level, so I had to increase some things. But generally, that formula, that basis, has always given me a pretty good barometer and made them feel challenged. It's not a knockout, drag out, almost TPK every time. And sometimes a boss might falter a little bit, but that's okay. That's going to happen, and that is D&D, and you need to be okay with that. These systems are far too complex in order to do everything perfectly, and it's going to take you a really long time to get a sense of what's right for you and what's right for that party. Also, things are going to change whenever you go from one table to the next. What's good for one table isn't going to work for the next. That's how complicated this game is, and you just need to find a framework that works for you. You need to be okay with things being a little too tough, a little too easy, and being surprised by things, because I actually think that's where the magic of D&D comes in. So what I have found out in this is that using that basic framework, making sure I have my goals, principles, objectives, all that kind of thing, and then an appropriately challenging fight, roughly, that what really matters more, especially after you've been playing a little while and everything starts to become old hat, what really matters more are the next 3 things I'm going to talk about. So the third thing I would like to talk about is dynamic mechanics and choices. And what do I mean by that? So, typical 5th edition D&D combat goes a little something like this. I attack. Does an 18 hit? Yes. Okay. 14 points of magical slashing damage. Okay. The enemy hits you. Does a 22 hit? Yes. 13 points of magical bludgeoning damage. Okay. Wizard's turn. You know what I mean? And that can be good enough, but what I found works a little bit better and excites things and moves things around is a little something where we introduce and you make use of the mechanics that are in the book that require a little bit more processing time, a little bit more thought of what's going on in the situation, and that move things quite literally around the battlefield. So a couple of the things I absolutely love to do is I want to make sure that the terrain has some kind of hazardous quality to it, whether that be, you're battling on a field of ice, there's a water surface nearby, there's some tangling vines, there's roaming poisonous clouds, whatever, or there's fire, gouts of fire or steam that burn you. Whatever it might be, there is something about the terrain that has a quality of elevation. So, you got to go from here to there, or, here to jumping, and also a quality of threat. So something like, like we just discussed, poisonous clouds, tangling vines, something like that. And if the encounter happens in a place where it really doesn't make sense for anything, although you can pretty much always shoe in a little something, you can make sure the boss or the enemy or the lair action is able to create that via spells like Spike Growth, Hunger of Hadar, Wall of Sand, Wall of Fire, or something like that. Something that changes the terrain a little bit and gets people thinking and gets people tuning in. Also, wonderful mechanics that match those things are things that allow the creature to change things up in terms of the rhythm of combat. So this can be like stunning, restraining mechanics, grappling. I've discovered that grappling is a wonderful way to really switch things up. Even if it's not optimal, it can be really entertaining to have a monster grapple a party member and start to drag them, try to drag them into the next room, try to drag them around their minions so that they can all be piled on. And it really changes the focus of what the party wants to do. It changes it from going, I'm going to hit this thing and kill it, to, I need to hit this thing 4 times and kill it. I need to stunning strike this thing that's grappled my party member. I need to cast this spell that's going to blow them all back. I'm going to cast Scatter and teleport them all in random directions. Something like that. Or, one of my favorites, I'm going to run up to my party member who's grappled or stained, etc., or in a really bad spot. I'm going to grab them, I'm going to cast Thunderstep and zoop on out of there, do a bunch of damage, and bring my party member to safety. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, combining these elements from one of our actual plays. In the episode titled Forgiveness, when they were trying to do battle in the Land of the Cold Unending, our version of the Feywild in Ghost of the Machine, I remember when they were coming up against a huge mountain elemental where had all these other minor little ice elementals, which I based off of the earth elemental, and they were fighting on a field that within the field beneath it were undead. So the earth elementals had this the tactic where they would pull the characters in and try to drag and burrow with them down into the earth, leaving them to suffocate and be attacked by zombies. Rather than just punch, and deal damage and whittle each other's health away, then the whole encounter kind of became like, get off the lava, so to speak. The proverbial, the floor is lava. And that really changed the thought process of what was going on. It also changed the way in which certain abilities were highlighted. No longer was, Fireball going to be the all-star of that fight. All of a sudden, the grassland druid Selena, her freedom of movement became a huge player in that encounter. She got dragged under, cast free movement on herself, shot straight to the top because she also had water walk on. And we ruled that would, shoot her straight to the top. So, freedom of movement and water walk had a circumference and an impact that normally maybe Fireball would against, a hall full of zombies. So right there you see the things at play, right? I had the terrain be kind of treacherous and difficult and something to be afraid of. I had the enemies use abilities rather than just attacking. They used a grapple and they used burrow to bring the enemies under, and it aligned with the players having an easy way out that allowed different abilities to shine. Dynamics are the ebbs and flows of a combat encounter that takes it from okay, we're just trading blows, to oh no, there's something big happening. Someone is restrained, someone is stunned, someone is grappled, someone's knocked unconscious, someone's asleep. Okay, we're back to normal. And that shift from highs to lows creates a certain level of excitement at the table, creates a certain level of focus at the table, and that is something when I'm building an encounter, I'm always looking for. I was like, okay, what would happen if this player got caught in a wall of thorns? What would happen if a poisonous cloud was right here and it was kind of rolling around? What would happen if the vampire grappled the bard and flew them up and started feeding on them? And you want to kind of consider how your players might deal with that, and it's okay if they have really easy solutions. It's also okay if the solutions are a little harder for them to achieve. Both are good. D&D is far too complex to account for everything. It's far too big and robust of a system to consider it all. You just want to try to find some things that are interesting, that your table enjoys, that you enjoy playing, and you want to introduce those into the encounter. And that brings me to step 4, which is really important, which is take your time. Take your time to read and take an extra moment to speak. One of the things that I always see, and I was so guilty of this for the first 30 episodes of Ghost of the Machine, is DMs rushing their players, rushing themselves, speaking very quickly, talking over each other, not reading the abilities either beforehand or during the encounter, and just trying to rush to make it seem more action-packed. It doesn't work. Let me say it again. It doesn't work. Do not rush yourself, do not rush your players, and do not rush the moments that can be savoring in order to enjoy your encounter. What I have found over 60 some odd episodes of one show and almost 30 of the next, and as a player of almost 30 episodes in another show and playing other systems, what I have found works for me and for most people I've played with is really taking an extra moment to speak, taking an extra moment to read over the abilities to make sure that you adjudicate them loudly and fairly, and making sure that those things work along. Because you might start to slow down and things might start to feel like they're taking forever to go, but as your players and as you gain more experience and build a better dialogue, you're going to find that little bit of slowdown is kind of good. It allows everyone to slow down, catch a breath, and get back to the action. Also, as far as taking your extra time to read, reading all about various monsters, just read the monster manual, cover to cover. Do it a couple times. And if you go out and buy other books like Dark Matter, matter or anything like that, go ahead and make sure you're reading those monsters' abilities too. Get familiar with them. Look up the rules that have been adjudicated. There's a lot of use cases and a lot of little different things in 5th edition D&D, which I think is a whole nother video I should do about how to adjudicate certain spells and how each spell works in a given table. A lot of misconceptions out there and a lot of ways that certain tables just like to play themselves. It's great to have those conversations ahead of time. So if you're doing your job, if you're reading ahead of time, thinking about the different interactions, and speaking about it with your players, you can make sure that everyone's on the same page and everything feels good and transparent. Which brings me to my 5th and final point, that is transparency. Transparency and clarity is absolutely essential to running an encounter in my mind. So there are certain things that your players just don't know. Like they probably don't know what spell the enemy is casting, especially at lower levels when they haven't seen most of these spells before, right? They don't know exactly what the armor class is of the enemy. They don't know the hit point totals. They don't know what saves they're good at. But as the encounter goes on, that information can be revealed. A couple of the things that I like to make very transparent when running an encounter from the DM side, I like to loudly declare what the 2-hit is, does a 25 hit, does a 29 hit. That way players can get a sense of the attack bonus, though they won't know the number exactly. And I also like to call out, whenever I'm rolling the saving throw for the boss or for the enemy, I say, well, that's a 10 plus 9, 19 con save. Or I might just be sure that I declare the result. Because if you say, oh, that's a 32 con save, they're going to know that that creature has at least a plus 12 bonus. I also like to make sure that I'm declaring how many legendary actions a certain legendary action is costing. They're going to spend all 3 legendary actions to cast a spell. They're going to spend 2 legendary actions to cast a spell. They're going to spend 1 legendary action to cast a spell or cantrip. They're going to use 1 of their legendary resistances. Now, I may not say, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4, whatever it might be, but I am always going to openly and loudly declare what the 2-hit is, what result they got on their saving throw, and whether or not they're using a legendary action, if so, how many, and I'm always going to declare what if they're using a legendary resistance. I really feel like that those transparent conventions really help 5th edition D&D combat move along. And I am someone that almost always says the number 2 hit against my players. I don't care how high or how low it is. I am going to say it. Now, when you're running a certain encounter, you fall and you're like, miss, who cares, right? But for the 2 hits, my players have cutting words. They have shields, defensive duelist, and these kind of abilities that really change the dynamics of the numbers. And I'm not going to make them play a guessing game. I'm going to tell them, it's a 25 to hit. That way they can be sure to use their abilities and have a really satisfying reaction whenever it happens. Another thing I like to do, unless something is an illusion or intentionally deceptive, I like to make sure I'm calling something a creature when it's a creature, an object when it's an object, a lair action when it's a lair action, a spell when it's a spell, and something when it's not a spell but a spell-like ability, I call it an ability. I try to be transparent so my players understand what is happening. I am not going to make my player waste a counterspell on a Deathlock's Grave Bolt, because not only do I think the rules wouldn't allow that, but I do not want my players to be full of doubt and concern, and honestly what feels like at a lot of tables mistrust whenever the DM conceals a lot of the information at play. I may not tell my players what spell is about to be cast, but once the spell is cast, they're usually going to know, or I might even just come out and say it. As the bolt of lightning shoot from one target to the next, a chain lightning spell does 47 points of lightning damage. But I'm going to try to give my players a healthy dose of information as the encounter goes on and be transparent with the mechanics so they can make informed decisions and play the game in a way that works for us and that is fun. Give them some information that lets them build the encounter in their minds and make clearer and better choices. And likewise, they of course owe you the same. Your players also owe it to you to be transparent. They owe it to you to call out their abilities when they're using it, describing them when you ask for it, and you owe them the same. I also really like to read spell descriptions of my enemies as I'm doing it to make sure that they're hearing what I'm saying, and that if any kind of rules dilemma or issue comes up, that I can adjudicate it fairly and transparently. This is such a huge thing. Transparency is so huge at the table because it is a foundation of consent. It allows people to know that they're on the same page, and that when they use an ability, they feel understood because they understand the ability the same way you understand the ability and how it's going to interact with the other abilities. You're going to learn with experience and time, and by communicating with your players. Beyond those things, I really think transparency is very important. Reading things aloud, telling your players what the numbers are and what's happening, taking that extra moment to speak clearly, repeating yourself when asked, doing those things will really help you and your players have an enjoyable encounter. So, let's go over that stuff one more time. 1, making sure your fight has a purpose. Is it to explore lore? Is it to get past the bad guy to the MacGuffin? Is it to let the players have a moment to breathe and have a good time and laugh at the zombie as they flail at the wizard tank? Making sure that its goal is clearly understood in the encounter. You got to save the orphan. You make sure this character doesn't kill this other character. You have to make sure this other character survives. You have to banish the enemy because you can't kill them. You have to get past them because they're unkillable. Something along those lines. Appropriately challenging. It either needs to be easy, medium, or hard. Using the rough CR system, from half to maybe equal to double of the character's level, depending on if you want an easy, medium, or hard encounter, and checking for a few breakpoints that might make the encounter not fun. Really high constitution saves that negate the monk's stunning strike, can't get through the legendary resistances. The enemy having too few no legendary resistances if it's a solo enemy, no legendary actions if it's a solo enemy, so it needs some in order to compete, otherwise it's going to get stomped, and things like that just make sure that the encounter stays appropriately challenging for what you're trying to do. And that can vary from having a very easy encounter to a very tough encounter. Dynamic mechanics and choices. Once you know that something is at stake and that you have the appropriate challenge set, you can consider the kind of things that might happen and that make things interesting, that make your players hone in, think about what's happening, and make choices beyond rolling an attack, hitting the enemy, returning the favor, rolling an attack and hitting and doing damage. So things like grapple, shove, restraining, walls, teleports, things like that move the enemies and players around the battle map, make for interesting choices, and cause serious dilemmas. 4th, taking time to read and taking an extra moment before you speak and adjudicate. Speaking clearly, breathe, relax your body and yourself. This is a game. You're all there to have fun. And sometimes when we get in very complex situations, the anxiety and the cognitive bandwidth can lead to some very difficult behaviors. It can lead to some very difficult times where you just are having trouble getting the words out. That is okay. We've all been there. Just take that extra moment to think clearly, to read, and use whatever tools and assets you have to in order to communicate to your players and then back to you. And 5th, of course, transparency. Being clear with what metagaming is good and what metagaming is helpful at the table with your players, and using that to your advantage so they can make decisions more clearly and use their abilities more effectively. And that way they feel like this encounter is using the rules that you've all agreed to play on, and that it is based and grounded in the game that you all decided to play. So transparency is huge in getting that done. Okay, so that is the 5 core principles that I've been kind of using lately. It's really led to some really great encounters over on Ghost of the Machine and Big Boy Season. It's things that I'm always revising, things I'm never always getting right. It's never going to be perfect, but it is certainly a framework that has helped me, because I wanted to speak more about that, but D&D is really, really complex. 5th edition combat is really, really complex. And while it may be the optimal thing to do is just to run up and hit each other and kill each other, I think of D&D combat as like roleplay. When you sat down at a table and played with someone who's trying to win at roleplay, we've all been there, right? We all know what that feels like. It doesn't feel good, right? Doesn't feel good. And I think that D&D combat is the same way. You don't want to sit down and decide who's going to win and how. You're going to want to sit down and decide, what's the good story here? What are the choices that I can make both as a player and a DM that make for an interesting and dynamic story. And these 5 core principles that I use have really helped me hone in on that. And there's so much more to say, and I think I'd like to make other videos about more specific use cases and the way that, like, how it feels streaming D&D combat and using a map and stuff like that. Let me know what you kind of want to hear more about. But that is the kind of framework that I use in our boss fights. If you want to check out our boss fights, go ahead and you can watch our actual plays, Ghost of the Machine, Big Boy Season, Dragon Heisters, which other people run. Or you can just check out the series, Just the Boss Fight, which is where I give you a brief introduction and outroduction, and I show you just the boss fights from Ghost of the Machine and other actual plays that we do. Okay, well, let me know in the comments what you want to hear next. I'm definitely going to be doing more of these. I really enjoy doing these YouTube videos. I really want to add to the overall discourse on D&D, not only encounter design, but other issues as well, and really share what I've gleaned after running so much. Having people come to me for advice about D&D encounters, I thought I'd make this video and just kind of get it all out there for all the masses to share. So make sure that you've liked, make sure that you subscribe, make sure that you comment, do all those things, and go ahead and push this video on your friends. See what they think. I hope you and your table can find something that works for you. And yeah, until next time.